I see the animals and the dead people in the picture, I remember that night when I went along the road to Guernica, after we left the air raid shelters. It was full of dead animals and people covered in sacks. Dead.
I've always been filled with emotion to see that woman burning on the balcony with her arms outstretched. I think she could be my grandmother.
Picasso's painting, Guernica. For two survivors, the town's bombing in the Spanish Civil War is a personal memory, but for nearly 50 years it has echoed in the conscience of the world. Spain, in the 1930s, was in many ways still struggling out of the 19th century, but it found itself the arena and battlefield for ideologies of the 20th. Men and women from all over the world fought for dreams of democracy, or communism, or fascism. Those ideas were later given a bitter, new meaning by the hindsight of global conflict and the Cold War. Europe in 1936. Hitler had been in power for 3 years. Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922. In Russia, Stalin had begun the show trials and purges of his enemies. Democracy everywhere was on the defensive. Britain and France were fearful of a European war. Then came the news from Spain.
All is turmoil in turbulent Spain, and the cost of political anarchy is death and destruction. This unhappy country, reft into two almost equal camps, illustrates all the tragedies of civil war under modern conditions. Innocent people lose their lives, property of law-abiding citizens is wrecked, and half the combatants fight half-heartedly for one cause or the other because they're forced to take sides. Such is the fruit of anarchy, of a people divided against itself.
The newsreels, as usual, had a simple explanation: anarchy. But in truth, Spain's crisis confused many an outsider. To understand it, they translated the peculiarly Spanish issues into their own. Spain became Europe's obsession.
The idea of the Spanish liberalism and the Spanish workers, the Spanish people, seemed a very passionate and pure cause. I remember that my Oxford tutor, who was a philosophy tutor, said that it was the only course in his lifetime in which there seemed a complete choice, absolute choice, between good as represented by the Spanish Republic and evil as represented by the Francoist forces.
The convictions of Europe's left were matched by their enemies on the right. Renzo Lodoli was an Italian fascist.
Mi sembrava che in Spagna fosse necessario difendere il cristianesimo, che era insidiato.
I thought that in Spain it was necessary to defend Christianity. It was under siege. We thought that fascism was valid as a social and political doctrine. So it was our duty to go and help those who wanted more or less the same thing as we did.
Più o meno volevano le stesse cose nostre.
Immediately, both sides sought and found gestures of support from rival sponsors abroad. In the liberal democratic world, individual sympathy for the plight of the Spanish Republic was widespread, but practical help from governments was to prove a different matter. The army rebels' pleas, on the other hand, were soon answered. Franco was not, at that time at least, a fascist. He was a conservative monarchist, but he was immediately assisted by European dictators who were fascists, and so he was inevitably identified with their kind of political despotism. Nevertheless, there is no evidence of any international fascist complicity in the Spanish general's original coup. On the contrary, in the summer of 1936, Hitler's thoughts were far from Spain. He was building a war machine for his own purposes, expansion in the east, and the repression of his opponents inside Germany. Hitler promised Britain that Germany wouldn't get involved in Spain. It was the first example of double talk in the Civil War, saying one thing and doing the opposite. Hitler had already sent aid. 2 days after the Spanish uprising, Franco had appealed to the Führer for help. After considering the consequence of a communist-influenced government controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, Hitler decided to send not the few anti-aircraft guns and fighters that Franco had asked for, but a full squadron of Junkers transport planes to airlift the Spanish Army of Africa from Morocco. "1,500 of these troops were transported to Seville to begin their fighting passage to Madrid. These crack troops of the Spanish army were to play a decisive role in the war. Hitler said later that Franco should erect a monument to the Junkers 52, the aircraft that Franco had to thank for his victory. Hitler might have congratulated himself too. His help was later rewarded with a constant supply of Spanish iron ore. This gave him a great advantage in his preparations for the World War that was to follow. But in 1936, most people still thought that war could be avoided.
Noi crediamo che l'Italia.
In 1936, Mussolini had not yet become Hitler's pawn.
Inquadrata in tutte le sue formazioni rivoluzionarie.
Indeed, many British hoped Italy could become an ally.
I suoi destini.
But Mussolini's conquest of Abyssinia had already shown that he was preparing aggressive expansion.
Alla potenza e alla gloria.
He wanted to turn the Mediterranean into what he called Mare Nostrum, our sea, another Italian lake. There was a natural challenge at the entrance to that lake. Throughout the 30s, Mussolini had dabbled with small-scale right-wing plots to subvert Spanish democracy. He had modestly financed the leader of Spain's fascist party, José Antonio, and allowed right-wing military groups to train on Italian soil. In 1934, in a written though informal agreement, Mussolini had promised to supply arms to Spanish monarchist conspirators should they overthrow the Republic. When the time came, after the uprising, he supplied 12 bombers, the first foreign military hardware to arrive in Spain's war. While Germany and Italy supported the army rebels, Léon Blum, the French Prime Minister of the recently elected Popular Front government, naturally identified with the Republican government of Spain. Léon Blum feared France's isolation. Still haunted by the terrible French losses in the 1914-18 war, and already flanked by 2 fascist powers, France certainly did not want to be trapped in a fascist triangle. Blum went to London to discuss plans for a collective security treaty with the British. Before he went, he ordered that arms be sent to Spain. At this meeting with Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, Spain was not officially on the agenda, but Blum discussed it anyway. On his return to Paris, he reported the conversation to Jules Moch, a member of his government.
Blum
told me of his talks with Eden
extraordinairement extra-européenne.
And the extraordinary non-European stance that both Eden and his colleagues were taking. Eden told Blum we shouldn't get mixed up in it, that even if war broke out in Europe over Spain, England, who was distant from all that, would remain neutral. Therefore, since France could not count on support from England, it would be wise for her to adopt the same position as the English. And I think I can recall that Blum told me that that would be a cowardly position.
In London, the British national government was worried. Conservative Prime Minister Baldwin and his ministers were concerned at all costs to avoid another world war and feared it could start in Spain. Alec Douglas Hume was then a backbencher.
If country after country began to take part in the war, then nobody could see the end of it. And it could end up in a big European conflict. Mussolini was careering around in the Mediterranean and making all sorts of trouble. Japan was restive. And of course, German realm was in full flood. And so we were very apprehensive about getting entangled in any other situation.
Britain's attitude didn't help the French Prime Minister Léon Blum. His plan for keeping European peace by protecting Spain was also in trouble at home. His policy of unrestricted military sales had threatened to split his government and might have precipitated serious civil unrest. He therefore reversed his original decision to send arms to Spain and devised another policy to save his face. On August 2nd, the French cabinet announced that they had decided to appeal urgently to interested governments for a pact of non-intervention. The British government, supported at this stage by its Labour opposition, responded eagerly.
I think France and Britain felt exactly the same on this issue. We did not want to get embroiled. And Mr. Blum thought of the policy of non-intervention, which wasn't a heroic policy at all. But nevertheless, it was a pragmatic policy.
As France closed its borders, the Spanish Republic felt let down. Under international law, it was legally entitled to buy arms abroad, but non-intervention stopped that. No one had ever claimed heroic intention for the policy. It was a diplomatic stratagem, a framework in which everyone could safely pursue their individual ends. They would fight their battles without actually going to war. No one thought it could curtail hostilities in Spain, or even that it should. Spain provided a safety valve to siphon off the political passions of Europe at that time.
Adesso quando si dice fascista si pensa alla violenza, alla dittatura. Però allora...
Nowadays, when you say fascist, you think of violence or dictatorship. But at that time, we youngsters didn't know anything else. We had been brought up and educated under fascism. We were convinced that it could be a valid formula to solve social problems.
Risolvere I problemi sociali, soprattutto del mondo.
Not all Italians were so convinced. Giovanni Pesci had been brought up in France. His parents had fled there to escape Mussolini's Italy.
The fight for the Spanish people was also a fight against Italian fascism. This was the reason I came voluntarily to fight in Spain.
La Passinaria, whose real name was Dolores Ibarruri, was a communist member of the Spanish Parliament. Her rhetoric rallied worldwide support for the Republic.
Era venuta la Passionaria a Parigi.
La Passionaria had come to Paris to ask for support, for help from the French people and the French government.
El pueblo francés no olvide que la lucha que en estos momentos sostiene el pueblo español es la lucha por la paz, es la lucha por la libertad.
She finished her speech by saying, if Spain is defeated, the world will be flooded with blood. And so I, a young, very young, militant of the anti-fascist movement, said that I must also go to give my contribution.
In Germany, communists had been the first target of Hitler's terror. And so when Hitler made clear his support for Franco, German communists knew which side they were on.
I believe that for us German anti-fascists, it was more poignant than for anybody else. We had tangibly experienced Hitler. Thousands of German anti-fascists were already in prisons and concentration camps, and we immediately recognized the connection between Franco's intentions and those of Hitler.
The politics of economic depression spilled over from the cities of Europe to a full-scale battlefield in Spain. It was mainly communists who travelled to do the fighting. Frank Deegan was an unemployed communist docker from Liverpool.
I believed that if Hitler and Mussolini managed to help Franco to win, then this would be a defeat for the whole Labour movement throughout the world. We thought, you know, the fascists of the world were ganging together, so a call went out for volunteers to help the Republican government.
The call came from Moscow. The International Committee of Communist Leaders, the Comintern, organized an international column of volunteers. Stalin himself, however, had his doubts. He was wooing Britain and France as allies against the Nazi threat and didn't want them scared off by communist intervention in Spain. He held back from sending arms. He did send advisors, ambassadors, and food. When the first Russian ship arrived in Barcelona, initial rapture gave way to disappointment when the consignment turned out to be not the guns that the Republic wanted, but canned milk. The guns only came later. Meanwhile, the Italian Foreign Minister, Ciano, met Hitler at Berchtesgaden in Germany. They agreed that their aid to the Spanish army rebels had to be increased, partly to counter Russian aid, and partly because Hitler had now decided he wanted to go over to the attack against the democracies. What had previously been a reflex action, a decision to supply Spain on request, became a concrete policy, a joint front against communism. A few days after Ciano and Hitler's meeting, Mussolini was heard for the first time to refer to the Rome-Berlin axis. Events in Spain had drawn Italy and Germany closer together, a step down the path towards the Second World War.
I hate war.
The world was very different in 1936. America was not the fulcrum of the world's foreign policy decisions. Still in dogged isolation from Europe's affairs, Roosevelt ignored the Spanish conflict and allowed the Texas Oil Company to supply Franco with fuel. In London, the non-intervention powers examined allegations of Italian, German and Portuguese intervention. The committee was chaired by the British. No one wanted the charges to stick, and they didn't. Von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, later joked, a more appropriate name for the organization would have been the Intervention Committee. Nowhere was this intervention clearer than in the battle for Madrid. Until October, the skies were dominated by the rebels, reinforced by German and Italian planes. The Spanish Republican Air Force was no match until Soviet planes arrived.
Just before the Soviet aid arrived, I had seen a demonstration of women marching along the Gran Via, the principal street in Madrid, shaking their fists at the German and Italian planes and shouting, "No pasarán, they shall not pass." 2 weeks later, there was another flight of planes over Madrid. This time they flew very low and dropped no bombs. Everyone looking up from the streets suddenly saw They were no longer Germans or Italians, they were Russian planes. And the cry went up that ran right through the city, son nuestros, they're ours, they're ours.
One day we were surprised to see some new machines in the sky, and we saw these small ones with snub noses. They flew around at a tremendous speed and shot down a nationalist plane occasionally. People began to get excited, started shouting, "Long live Russia!" They started to hug each other.
Just 15 weeks after the start of the war, the Republic's capital, Madrid, was on the front line. The rest of the Republic lay behind. The army rebels held the territory north and west of the capital. Their land offensive began on November 7th. With only 25,000 men, the nationalists were attempting to capture a city of 1 million inhabitants. Franco had made ready lists of people to be arrested. Having met little resistance so far, he could not have anticipated the stubborn reaction of the Madrid people. No pasarán, they shall not pass, had become the slogan of Madrid, and indeed of all Republican Spain. The government under Largo Caballero left the capital for the safety of Valencia. So did many of the population. For those who stayed, some preparation to defend the city had already been made. General Miaca, one of the army officers who stayed loyal to the Republic, led the defense junta in charge of the overall political and military control of Madrid. Miaca and his staff officers were joined by Communist Brigade Commander Enrique Lista.
The population had been prepared politically to receive the enemy with boiling water, with oil, with anything that came to hand, from their balconies and roofs. The defense of Madrid was more thanks to the people of Madrid than to the militias.
Entonces esta gente se incorporó a la lucha, pero sin pasar por casa. Salieron del comercio.
People joined up at once. They didn't even bother to go home. They were given some hand grenades and a rifle, and with their ordinary jacket and trousers, they got into waiting vehicles or into a tram and went off to fight. This was really striking and wonderful. It was one of the most wonderful moments of the war.
Everyone in Madrid was involved. Loyal officers staffed the army. Ordinary people built defenses for the city. Political parties recruited men for defense militias. But most of all, an organized army was created. However barely trained and equipped, 10 new brigades of the popular army of regular soldiers, mixed with volunteers, were naturally a more effective fighting force than the old militia columns. The people's resistance was stiffened by the approach of Franco's troops and by potent propaganda.
Madrid, corazón de España, late con pulsos de fiebre. Si ayer la sangre le hervía, hoy con más calor le hierve. Ya nunca podrá dormirse, porque si Madrid se duerme, querrá despertarse un día y el alba no vendrá a verle. No olvides, Madrid, la guerra. Jamás olvides que enfrente los ojos del enemigo te echan miradas de muerte. Rondan por tu cielo halcones que precipitarse quieren sobre tus rojos tejados, tus calles, tu brava gente.
Wir in fernen Vaterland geboren, nahmen nicht als harten Herzen mit.
For 2 generations, the Spanish Civil War has been remembered for the international brigades. This fighting force of 40,000 men was a unique expression of international solidarity. There were Frenchmen, Greeks, Poles, Italians, Americans, Canadians, Irish, Czechs, Australians, Swedes, Swiss. There were 2,000 British, 500 of them died. But the war was already 4 months old, and Madrid under siege by the time the first organized volunteers arrived in the city to take up positions at the front. One of the first battalions was predominantly German. It was named after Ernst Thälmann, the leader of the German Communist Party, who was in a Nazi concentration camp at the time.
Ganz normalen Spruch gebrauchen, sagen ins Herz geschlossen.
They took us straight to their hearts.
Sie wussten, weshalb wir kamen und hielten
They knew
uns
why
aber
we'd
vorher,
come.
oder sagen wir mal,
They had one slogan for us all, long live Russia. They treated us as if we were Russians, and only slowly they got to realize we were Germans.
Langsam stellte sich heraus, dass wir ja auch Deutsche waren.
So far, Madrid had been bombed by Germans, the Condor Legion, and now suddenly there were Germans on their side.
With a background of military service, a life of resistance to persecution that bred political discipline, these German communists were an example to the Spanish.
For me, seeing them brought the joy of solidarity and warmth. They left a profound impression on me. Also, they showed us the things we had to learn, what discipline is, what an army is. Until then, we'd been a militia, not a regular army.
Not all Republicans were so happy about the volunteers. In Catalonia, some anarchists feared their revolution was being taken over by communists. They arrested a party of international brigaders arriving from France. But in Madrid, everyone was grateful for any relief from the enemy. The international brigaders were rushed up to the front to help their Spanish allies resist the rebel army attack. There was fighting in the Casa del Campo, a park on the western edge of the city. On November 15th, 1936, the rebels finally broke through Madrid's defenses at a point in the university campus overlooking the park. The international brigades held the line in the philosophy faculty, but 2 days later the rebels attacked again and occupied part of the clinical hospital. The Thälmann battalion found themselves defending one floor of the hospital from the Moors on the floor below.
Wir saßen auch schon wieder in der dritten Etage oben.
We were on the third floor. We'd knock holes in the ceiling, and then we'd throw hand grenades down to clear them out.
Fallen gelassen, unten aufzuräumen und umgekehrt. Also das heißt,
in this fight, there was hardly ever a real front, a front which was clearly defined.
Begrenzte Fronten gab es in diesem Kampf kaum.
Eventually the line stabilized, and Madrid held out. So Franco tried a new tactic. The Civil War became a testing ground for modern weapons. It was a foretaste of what was to happen a few years later in London, Hamburg, Tokyo, and Leningrad. But until now, no city in history had been so sorely tested. Scenes like this, on newsreels all over the world, confirmed the sympathy that attracted so many people to the Republic. Journalists like Ernest Hemingway went to report and became propagandists. The original complex Spanish causes of the war were distilled into the poetic certainties of right and wrong. Wogan Phillips, now the only communist in the British House of Lords, went to drive an ambulance. Stephen Spender, the English poet, went with him to look.
We are obsessed by the feeling that this is the supreme cause of our time, a cause of poets and of writers, the cause of freedom, and that unless the cause of anti-fascism was won, unless fascism was defeated, we wouldn't be able to exist as writers.
Like so many British radicals, Spender at that time was a member of the Communist Party, but he represented the liberal wing of English intellectual thought.
I think there was a later generation of John Cornford and Julian Bell who got killed in Spain, who felt that they wanted to submerge their literature, their independence of mind as intellectuals, even their existence as intellectuals, which seemed subjective to them, within the objectivity of Marxism.
This was the generation of Philby and Maclean. Philby was in Spain for a while, working as a Times correspondent with Franco's forces. In fact, he was spying for the Russians. Julian Bell had developed his Marxist ideas at Cambridge, in the same secret society, the Apostles, which included Anthony Blunt. The threat of fascism had turned a generation of English intellectuals into communists. The brutal realities of Stalin's Soviet Union had not yet been made known. Some people like George Orwell, however, who had gone enthusiastically to fight for the Spanish Republic, came to appreciate in Spain the danger of all-pervasive totalitarian communism. He joined the anti-Stalinist party, the POUM. The persecution of the POUM by the official communists disillusioned many who thought the Republic was a democracy. Most volunteers, though, were communists, and those who weren't felt isolated.
I remember going to the front near Madrid once and meeting a young man there who was an English public school boy, and he said to me, well, you know, I came to Spain and joined the International Brigade because I understood it to be a liberal republican organization, and what I found is that it's an entirely communist organization. And then he said, I would spend the rest of my life every day walking up to that ridge that you can see a few hundred yards away, and that'll be the end of me. And he certainly was disillusioned, although he accepted this, and he was killed within 6 weeks.
But for many Spaniards, the Soviet Union's support seemed a salvation. In 1937, Teresa Pamias was a member of the Socialist Youth.
I és que la Unió Soviètica ens ajudava. Era el país que venia armes al govern legítim de la República.
The Soviet Union sold guns to the government of the legitimate republic. Guns came to Barcelona in their ships. It brought us this feeling of mythical togetherness, which became very solid.
This comradely solidarity had a hard business edge. All the arms were paid for. Spanish gold reserves had been sent to the Soviet Union. They supplied the arms. Political influence came with them. In Madrid, morale was sustained by showing epic Soviet films like Kronstadt, celebrating the defense of the Soviet Revolution of 20 years earlier. But the Soviet influence was not revolutionary in Spanish terms. On the contrary, the Communist Party's disciplined approach to fighting the war and keeping order attracted large sections of the middle classes in the Republican zone. They had been frightened by the rival anarchist revolutionary ambition for the Republic. At the end of 1936, Stalin wrote to Largo Caballero and argued in diplomatic French that the Republic should collaborate with liberals and conservative peasants. It is necessary to prevent the enemies of Spain considering her a communist republic, he said. Stalin, remember, still needed Britain and France on his side. They were still not his certain allies against the threat of Hitler. And in Spain, Hitler's intentions were becoming clear. His ambassador formally recognized the Franco regime during the Battle for Madrid, and now Hitler could hardly afford to let the rebels lose. Germany increased its aid and sent instructors to train nationalist officers. This gave Franco's rebels a useful but still not decisive advantage. The nationalists were holding about 60% of Spain, but they were short of troops and had stalled on a front of 1,200 miles. In spite of a dangerous bulge around Madrid, the Republic was holding its ground. The nationalist sponsors became impatient, particularly Mussolini. Without even consulting Franco, he began to send large numbers of Italian volunteers to Spain. Their first battle was at Malaga. It was an easy victory. It shortened the front and raised nationalist morale. The nationalists now tried to encircle Madrid, first from the south by crossing the Jarama Valley. Republican reinforcements, including international brigades, were rushed up to the front line. After 10 days, the battle had spent itself, with heavy losses on both sides. There immediately followed another attempt to encircle Madrid, this time from the north at Guadalajara. The Italians, supremely confident after their victory at Malaga, persuaded Franco to let them fight alone. On the Republican side, the Italians from the Garibaldi battalion of the International Brigades took up position against their fellow countrymen.
Questa era la posizione del battaglione Garibaldi.
This was the position of the Garibaldi battalion. Headquarters was near the woods. The fascists were here, all in this area.
Poi verso le 11 mezzogiorno vediamo passare due macchine.
Then, at about noon, we saw two cars go by. We stopped them and they said to us, "But we are Italians." We answered, "We're Italians too."
Giovanni Pesci and his comrades had found just what they had come to Spain for, the opportunity to fight Italian fascists.
They
started to raise their hands, very worried, and began to cry, "Don't shoot us, we are Italians too. It's not our fault if Mussolini sent us here. They told us they were sending us to Abyssinia." We took them prisoner and took them to the command.
When the Republican troops routed the Italian opposition, Mussolini was furious. He decided that no Italian could return home until they'd won a victory. Foreign aid on both sides poured into Spain at a faster rate than ever before. But it was not enough to clinch the war, only to prolong it. And Madrid was now a stalemate. It remained so until the end of the war, 2 years later. So the nationalists switched their offensive to the north. The western part of the Basque country was still Republican. It had been separated from the main Republican zone since the early days of the war. This northern region was a potentially valuable prize on account of its heavy industry and mineral wealth. It was a special region in other ways. Here conservatives were fighting side by side with anarchists and socialists. The Basques gave the lie to Franco's claim that his campaign was a Christian crusade. The region is the most devout Catholic area in the country. Here people prayed for victory against the nationalists. Their opposition to Franco and support for the Republic came from the traditional Basque yearning for the home rule of their region, so distinctive from the rest of Spain. The Liberal Republic recognized that ambition, but the nationalists who believed in the unity of Spain were determined to crush it. The attack began on March 31st. The nationalist, General Moller, threatened to raise the region to the ground. He nearly succeeded. But first, the nationalists tried to starve the Basques into submission. The sea blockade of Republican ports posed an embarrassing problem for Britain. Several British merchant ships, legally commissioned to deliver food supplies to the Republic, were stuck in the French port of Saint-Jean-de-Luz. The British government was reluctant to challenge Franco's navy by supplying escorts for their merchantmen. Despite outcry from the House of Commons, Eden announced that British ships would be protected only outside a 3-mile limit of Bilbao. At the same time, the British were secretly negotiating with the Nationalists for the output of British-owned mines in Spain. On April 19, 1937, a Captain Roberts, the master of one of those ships, the Seven Seas Prey, became anxious to leave Saint-Jean-de-Luz before his cargo rotted. Captain Roberts defied the British order and set sail for Bilbao. His daughter, Fifi, was on board.
So at 10 o'clock we darkened ship and pulled up anchor and sailed out. Frantic flashings from the shore, and a searchlight was played on us, but Father was doing a Nelson act, you see. He just shut that eye, and we sailed on. I mean, there's nothing to it.
In spite of the warnings of the British government and the threats that Bilbao harbour had been mined by the Nationalists, the Seven Seas Spray arrived unscathed and sailed up Bilbao River.
We were the first in, and were told there's only 4 days' food left for the people. Everybody was cheering, hooters were going. It was rather like a ticker tape reception. Only we were coming up the river and everybody was hanging out from all their windows and waving and cheering. It was quite emotional.
Captain Roberts and Fifi became the Basque people's heroes. The Seven Seas Spray had exposed the Nationalist blockade as a myth, and other British merchant ships followed with food supplies. But the Basques couldn't celebrate for long. "10 miles behind the front line was the small market town of Guernica, with a population of 7,000. It was the historic centre of Basque nationalism. The tree of Guernica, the symbol of Basque freedom, stood beside the Parliament building where traditionally all Spanish monarchs had sworn to uphold Basque liberties. April 26, 1937, was Market Day.
The market was held where the public gardens of Guernica are now. Everything was normal, but then the planes came in the afternoon.
Doña Ignacia Otomith lived in Guernica with her 2 daughters, Connie and Manoli.
We were in the industrial zone, and over the hills opposite, I saw the planes arriving. First, just one of them. It circled twice, but we were used to seeing it do that and fly away again. But scarcely 10 or 15 minutes later, more arrived, and we were able to count them. There were 8, all in a line, black. I remember them as very black and ugly.
I'll never forget the noise the bombs made, a kind of fizz, followed by cries. Then a tremendous crash, over and over again. I can still hear the noises, and we could feel everything tremble. Smoke and heat came in.
43 aircraft, mainly German, took part in wave after wave of attacks on the small town. Karl von Kanar was the squadron leader of the Condor Legion which bombed Guernica.
This had no impact on me. I conducted these attacks and operations in the course of my duties as a soldier, carrying out my orders without heed for my life. At the time, we thought we were fighting a war against communism.
The Condor Legion might have believed the Catholic Basques were communists, but the Spanish High Command who ordered the attack knew otherwise. For both of them, Guernica's cultural significance was more or less irrelevant. It was a military target. There was a small arms factory, and Republican soldiers retreating from the nationalist attack had to pass through the town to reach the last line of defense round Bilbao. The Germans claimed their instructions were to bomb the bridge and crossroads at the edge of Guernica in order to make the road to Bilbao impassable. In 3 hours, 100,000 pounds of incendiary, high explosive and shrapnel bombs were dropped on the town. Little remained standing, except the arms factory and the Germans' main target, the bridge.
Wir haben durch die Windversetzung deutlich sehen können,
we could clearly see that the wind blew the bombs onto the fields. They missed the bridge and the houses by it. The Junkers were really commercial airplanes converted into bombers. That is, they were equipped with what we called a pot slung underneath the plane. It could be retracted during takeoff and landing and lowered during flight. And the poor observer had to climb down a tiny ladder into this contraption with his goggles and his flying helmet on. And there he had a primitive targeting device and rangefinder.
The Germans' excuses don't explain why they did not use accurate Stuka dive bombers to destroy their objective, the bridge at the edge of Guernica, nor the fact that they machine-gunned the fleeing population, nor the magnitude of the whole operation.
I can still remember, and I was just 9 years old, the force of the blast of heat in my face as I came out. All the buildings next to the factories were burning, everything on fire. The sky was red with the reflections.
2 days after the bombing, Fifi Roberts was taken with her father to see the devastation of the town. 45 years later, she returned to Guernica to revisit the scene she had photographed with her own camera.
Along the road, there are streams of refugees trudging along. I don't think they had any idea where they were going, what they were going to do. They were on carts, wheelbarrows, anything that had a wheel that was being pushed, and a few of their belongings on it. It's rather heartbreaking to see. And then when we got into Guernica itself, there wasn't a building standing. There's rubble all over the place. Nobody to be seen except the odd soldier. I think they'd been still looking in the ruins for bodies. Luckily, we didn't see any, but the place was an absolute shambles.
72 hours after the raid, before the reckoning of destruction could be completed, the rebel army arrived at Guernica. They immediately began a propaganda offensive as well, making show of guarding the famous Basque Tree of Liberty. They even tried to put the blame on the Basques for destroying their own town.
Cierta prensa aseguró que esta desgraciada ciudad fue destruida por la aviación nacionalista. La trabación de hierro del frontón y los bidones de gasolina acumulados frente a la iglesia demuestran que fueron patrullas de incendiarios quienes echaron sobre sus hombros la tristísima misión de arrasar la pintoresca cuna del fuerismo vasco.
Some people were even prepared to believe this. The nationalists' real prize lay ahead. To protect their rich industries, the Basques had built a defensive wall around Bilbao, a ring of iron. But it could not protect the city from intensive bombing. With Bilbao about to fall, the Western democracies finally felt free to help. The children of Republican Spain were catalogued, given medical inspections, labeled and transported to England, France, Belgium, America, and the Soviet Union. Franco soon broke through Bilbao's defenses and seized the region's industries and mines intact. Soon ships left Bilbao with new cargoes. Soon Franco was exporting iron ore. His clients included Germany and Britain. Both countries were to use the captured resources of the Republic for their own rearmament program. Non-intervention, either real or phony, didn't interfere much with business or prevent the world war that was to follow. Valle de los Caídos, in Spain, the Valley of the Fallen. Nearly half a century after the Civil War, the men who created and won that war have preserved its massive monument. General Franco called the uprising against the Republican government a crusade, a fight for Christian civilization. Others called it fascism. It was for nearly 3 years the world's moral arena. Inside this mausoleum today, there is no hint of reconciliation. This huge tomb for Franco's men was hewn in a granite mountain by his defeated enemies, Republican prisoners of war. Before this altar of Christian piety and Francoist victory lies a man who led Spain's fascist party, José Antonio. The great dome celebrates the victorious nationalists almost as a celestial host, and below it, behind the altar, the Generalissimo himself, Franco, now deeply part of the Spanish language, in homage or hate. As a soldier, Franco had served the Republic, but his heart was monarchist. He was called a fascist and died a dictator. The contradictions of Franco are part of the heart of Spain itself. It was said, in time to come, that Franco was a cautious and even reluctant conspirator in the army's coup d'etat, which began the Civil War. But he became Europe's longest ruling dictator of our century, the archetype of dominant endurance. When Franco was born in 1892, Spain was still a proud imperial power. Franco was a child with that empire dissolved. The American wars lost Cuba and the Philippines. It was a grievous blow to Spanish pride, and also a knock for the young Franco. He had wanted to follow his father and brother into the Spanish Navy, but with the dissolution of an overseas Spain, that was cut back. So for Francisco Franco, it had to be the unglamorous and rather disgruntled army. For Franco, and so many of his class and generation, the army was his education. It confirmed the political images of the past, which were romantic or ambitious, or probably both. Spain had lost its empire, but it still clung desperately and bitterly to its last vestige of glory abroad. In its protectorate of Morocco, Spain sought to erase its humiliations far away by redoubling its military dominance. At home, as so often in military restlessness, party politics meant very little. The officers were either indifferent or vaguely hostile. The only consideration almost religious, was patria, the fatherland. As a career army officer, Francisco Franco flew very high and very fast. He became in succession the youngest captain, major, and colonel. By the age of 33, he was a general. He had commanded the Spanish Foreign Legion for 4 years, following his personal mentor, the much wounded and scarred hero, General Millán Astray. Millán Astray was the founder of this disciplined and brutal elite of the Spanish army. The Foreign Legion was used to suppress the Asturias rebellion against the Republican government in 1934. This was the regiment's first military use at home. It was an experience no one forgot, and Franco advised on the conduct of the operation. Later, he was appointed Chief of Staff and served under the Republic. As such, he represented Spain at the funeral of the English King George V at Windsor in January 1936. Franco himself was personally and politically a monarchist. He supported the restoration of the Spanish king, who had fallen from power 4 years earlier. Few people know that Francisco Franco once nudged his way into the movie business. After the war, he wrote a feature film under a pseudonym, which reveals his contempt for democratic politics. The script follows the lives of 3 brothers. It's a situation not unlike Franco's own family. His younger brother Ramon was a Republican. And in this scene, one brother, who wants to be a Republican politician, is arguing with another, an army officer, about using his inheritance for a political career.
Mira, José, no trates de embrollar este asunto. Ella lo ha pensado y tiene razón.
Their mother has agreed to share out the estate. It was perhaps easier for Franco to understand than for us.
Que es mucha bondad la de prescindir de todo al fin y al cabo para una mala empresa. ¿Llamas mala empresa que yo trate de salir diputado? De tu significación, sí, comprendo. Buena empresa la de los militares, que por pintar por ahí la cigüeña os aseguramos la vida a todos los ciudadanos. Dices ese disparate porque te duele que seamos el principal estorbo para vuestros manejos turbios e indignos. José.
Pedro.
Sí, indignos vosotros.
Quieto, José, ven conmigo.
Es que no queréis que tenga ni un solo día feliz.
Todo esto se acabará muy pronto. Dios quiera que sea el día en que cada uno estemos en distinto papel.
Ya está bien, José.
The film's breathless commentary goes on to describe the 5 years of Spain's fragile democracy, in Franco's version of events at least.
Como si el reto de los dos hermanos tuviese un signo profético y fatal, así iba a dividirse la familia española. El Frente Popular que el Comintern comunista patrocinó va a destruir las puras esencias de la tradición española. La hora de la revolución comunista había sonado. España no podía perecer.
Destruction of traditional values, communist revolution. These were the catchwords with which the insurgent generals rallied most of Spain's middle class against the Republic. Petra Roman de Bondia was a young girl from a conservative family in Salamanca.
I thought that the military uprising would bring an improvement in every sense. Our ideals and what we thought Franco and his army were going to defend were God, the homeland, the family, and order.
Patria, familia y orden. Eso nos parecía que iba a cambiar todo.
We thought that the rising would change everything. We never imagined that it would be such a long
Nunca
war.
creímos que iba a ser una guerra tan grande.
Before the war, in the 5 years of democracy between 1931 and 36, the Spanish Republic had not just been a new order. It had questioned all the assumptions of accepted society, and now some people wanted to put the clock back. Tomás Garicano Goñi was a young army officer.
Yo creo que las esperanzas de todos eran fundamentalmente negativas. Es decir,
I think that most of our hopes were fundamentally negative. That is to say, we wanted to stop certain things. Public disorder, the labor upheavals which did so much harm to both management and workforce.
evitar y cortar la persecución religiosa.
We wanted to do away with religious persecution. Not only was religious education banned, but also any teaching by the religious orders. We wanted really to return to a more traditional Spanish way of life, a peaceful one, which this Republican government had failed to bring.
The social upheavals of the Republic had led to a progressive breakdown of law and order. In the countryside, peasants hungry to own the land they worked seized it. Some landowners had been killed, and others feared for their lives.
Peace was impossible, so we had to head for the hills. If it's just not possible to live, then you have to find a different solution, which was the rising against the Republic.
Franco had begun with curious discretion. He had joined the army coup in Morocco with expressly limited aims of restoring order and crushing the revolution. But his proclamation did not invoke the church or any crusade. He did, to be sure, hint darkly about foreign influences assailing traditional values. What was surprising to some was that his proclamation concluded with the unexpectedly democratic slogans fraternity, liberty, equality. But that, he said, was the absolute order of their priority. The first army decrees gave instant comfort to its middle-class supporters. That was fairly easy. All the land the Republican reforms had shared out was to go back to the owners. Trade unions were banned. So were all political parties of the Popular Front. But first, the army had to face the fact that its initial coup had failed. Armed working-class resistance had defeated the army rising in 5 key cities. Spain was divided. The Republican government held Madrid, the Basque Country, and nearly half the rest of Spain. And the Nationalist command was split. General Mola in the north, and in the south Franco with his Army of Africa. The Nationalists' original plan had been to install General Sanjurjo as commander-in-chief, but he died in a plane crash as he left Portugal to take command in Spain. It left a difficult gap. Two months later, the rebel generals gathered for a meeting in Salamanca. A strong lobby for Franco was gaining ground. All but one voted in favor of a single commander-in-chief. The sole objection was from Miguel Cabanillas, who had been temporarily appointed leader of the military junta. Next, Franco was proposed. Again, all but Cabanillas agreed. The decision was delayed. What was desperately needed was a man whom all under arms on the insurgent side would support. Already the insurgents were split with differences. There was the old Peninsular Army. There was the Civil Guard, the Army of Africa, Spanish units and Moors, let alone the armed militias of the Fascist Phalange and columns of monarchists and traditionalists. All these armed factions had conflicting expectations of their leader. Alone among the rivals, Franco seemed to satisfy the factions. He was the man in the middle. His reputation too as a soldier ensured him popular support, and this was immediately reinforced by events.
Driving on to the relief of Toledo, the advance of General Franco's columns from the west is pushed on remorselessly. White troops and Moors, well armed and trained in modern methods of warfare, supported by powerful artillery, overcome the resistance of government militia, whose retreat is on Madrid rather than Toledo. General Franco arrives to embrace and honor Colonel Moscardo, the brave and bearded commander.
The victory at Toledo inflated Franco's prestige. Even before his appointment as commander-in-chief was announced, his supporters were planning higher office for him. They proposed he should be not only supreme military commander, but head of the government. Some of his colleagues were doubtful. Nevertheless, Francisco Franco emerged as the undisputed leader and called himself head of state. On October 1st, 1936, Franco was granted all powers of the new state of Spain, at least for the duration of the war.
My personal reaction to Franco's appointment was one of relief. Nationalist soldiers were saying, a single command wins a war. A split command loses a war. Franco's appointment was unquestioned. There wasn't anyone else who could hold a candle to him, and it was a source of great relief all round.
The army generals who appointed Franco as head of government, as a military necessity, may not have realized that they were establishing a personal dictatorship. Many different groups had supported their rising. First, the conservatives, who had supported the right-wing parliamentary coalition Theda before the war. Second, the monarchists, who sought the restoration of King Alfonso. Third, the Carlists, mainly from Navarre. They were also called traditionalists. They were religious, supported a king too, albeit a different claimant, and fought for their regional rights. Fourth, the Phalange, the fascist party, outlawed by the Republic. They claimed to transcend the right and left of politics, but called for a radical social revolution. General Moller, for one, was fully aware of the wild complexity of the various factions. He had successfully negotiated the support of both the Carlists and the Phalange for the plot. Soon after Franco's appointment, Moller spoke to Pedro Sáenz Rodríguez, a right-wing monarchist intellectual who had joined the uprising and later joined Franco's government.
I remember very well that there was a large armchair in front of the desk, and General Moller was sitting on the arm of it with his feet on the seat, and he asked me, "What do you think will happen when the war ends?" I said there will be a problem with all the different political interests. He said, "I'm pleased to hear you say that. When the war is over, it will be necessary to have some sort of constitution and parliament."
In Franco's plan, there was no question of a parliament. The army decree gave all powers of the new state to him. He referred to himself as head of state twice in his first proclamation.
Viva España!
For many people, his own political ideology was a mystery. Did he have a political theory?
Many people thought that he was a man who was keeping a secret, but I called him the Sphinx without a secret. He had the air of a Sphinx, but there was no secret. He was silent on many subjects because he had no opinion on them.
Franco had never claimed to be a politician, but he was of the intuitive right, an instinctive defender of capitalism. With his brother Nicholas as secretary, he prepared his program. No working-class trade unions, help for peasants, but land for landowners, concord with the church. Above all, no democracy. That way, perhaps, the working-class opposition could be wiped out forever.
Un Estado totalitario armonizará en España el funcionamiento de todas las capacidades y energías del país, en el que dentro de la unidad nacional el trabajo, estimado como el más ineludible de los deberes, será el único exponente de la voluntad popular. Y merced a él podrá manifestarse el auténtico sentir del pueblo español a través de aquellos órganos naturales que, como la familia, el municipio, la asociación y la corporación, harán cristalizar en realidades nuestro ideal supremo.
These aims of the Spanish right could only be secured by repression. Even before Franco took command, working-class resistance was physically extinguished by advancing nationalist columns. Franco himself continued the purge.
Franco estaba un día que fui yo a hablar con él, que me llamó para una interview que le habían hecho.
One day when I went to see Franco, he called me for an interview before I was a minister. He was sitting at a table drinking chocolate, dunking bits of bread and biscuits into it, and he had a heap of files on the left and was classifying them. Some he put on the table, others on a chair. Afterwards, on leaving, I asked an adjutant what were those files which General Franco had. They were the death sentences. Those which he placed on the chair were for signing, and the others for revision. It was something done quite calmly. For him, it was simply a military matter.
There were few critics of these methods in the nationalist zone. Franco's supporters were united in the common cause of defeating the Republic. But as to what to replace it with, there was much dispute. First, there were the Fascists, the Falange. Before the war and his imprisonment, their leader, José Antonio, had tried to present a doctrine of seductive simplicity.
Tenemos una fe resuelta es que están vivas todas las fuentes genuinas de España. España ha venido a menos por una triple división. Por la división engendrada por los separatismos locales, por la división engendrada entre los partidos y por la división engendrada por la lucha de clases. Cuando España encuentre una empresa colectiva que supere todas esas diferencias, España volverá a ser grande como en sus mejores tiempos.
The Falange's fascism was disguised by revolutionary jargon. Narciso Perales was one of its first members.
The Falange was a revolutionary movement which wanted to carry out profound changes in the Spanish society of those times, changes which are still necessary today. José Antonio proclaimed a doctrine which resolved opposing doctrines in society. It upheld spiritual values and the belief in the fatherland as our common and universal destiny, and at the same time it aimed for a social revolution. The agrarian reform would turn the land over to the peasants, so that the vision of giving the ownership of the land to those who work it would come true. Banks would be nationalized because it was considered unjust that the savings of all the Spanish people should be controlled by a few who dominated the economy of the country.
The Falange's leadership was predominantly middle class or aristocratic young men, but the movement was designed to appeal to working class sentiments, albeit staunchly anti-Marxist. Raimundo Fernández Cuesta later became Secretary General of the Falange.
We discussed whether we should wear any distinctive clothing. José Antonio said we should wear a blue shirt. It's the same color as the proletariat's overalls. And it was the same for the flag. It was black and red because that was the flag of the anarchist trade unions. We wanted ours to be similar. The same with the word comrade, traditionally used by the communists. José Antonio said, I don't see why we shouldn't claim it ourselves. Give the word comrade a different meaning.
In spite of its pretensions, the Falange never became a mass fascist party with large working-class membership. Unlike what had happened in Germany and Italy, fascism had not taken root in Spain before the war. For one thing, the economic conditions were very different. Spain was still economically in the 19th century. The groups that might have been attracted by fascism were either satisfied by conventional politics or just non-existent. There was no large petty bourgeoisie scarred by recession or defeat in a world war. The middle class was reassured that the dominant presence of the army would protect them from revolution. And the working class had suffered no disappointment that might provoke them to find an alternative to Marxist, socialist, or anarchist ideals. In 1936, however, after the February elections when democracy disintegrated into political violence, conservative youth had begun to defect to the radical alternative. And once the war began, people flocked to the Falange. It was a demonstration of allegiance to the nationalist cause. And moreover, with the purge of working-class organizations, it became a safe haven for anybody whose background was suspiciously leftist. The blue shirt became known as a salvavidas, a life jacket. Some nationalists, however, viewed the Falange's populist and violent image with distaste.
There were many people who joined the Phalangists, but I could never join them because I did not consider them to be virtuous in the Christian sense of the term. I did not think that the Phalangists were Christians. I did not think that they acted in a way that I considered to be correct, and I never liked them. There was a phobia against Phalangism in my family, partly because the Theta and the Falange were totally opposed to each other, and we all belonged to the Theta.
The greatest contrast to the Falange was another faction of nationalists, the Carlists, the deeply traditionalist group based in Navarre. They lived in the romantic, almost medieval past.
We were defending God, the fatherland, and our king. This was the traditional slogan of Carlism. By God, we meant religion in its true sense, with no interference by the church in the government of the state. As for politics, we were in favor of regional rights. That is, we saw Spain as a conglomeration of regions which have, from time to time, been united by a common cause of Spanish nationality.
Franco was no fool. He recognized the potential danger of disunity in the nationalist camp. To his brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Sr., he gave the job of devising a formula for uniting the factions.
Los objetivos eran evitar las discordias y las.
The objectives were to avoid internal conflicts and rivalry, which were bound to debilitate the nascent state.
This
was Franco's view, and as commander-in-chief and leader in the war, I think he was right. He sought to establish and maintain a certain order and discipline in the rear guard. If the rear guard was left to the whims of the different groups, things could get out of hand and could affect the situation in the fighting fronts, as happened in the Republican zone.
The Falange was in trouble. José Antonio had been killed in a Republican jail. All other potential candidates were in prison or dead, and the organization was riven with ideological and personal schism. On April 17, 1937, a former mechanic, Manuel Edia, was confirmed as leader. He had no formal education, was unimaginative, and ineffective. He was easy meat for Franco. 2 days after his election, Franco, as head of state, declared the Falange and the Carlists would be unified in one national movement under his own direction. When Edia challenged Franco's authority, he was sentenced to death, although this sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. By bringing the red-berried Carlist and the blue-shirty Falange movement under his direct leadership, Franco assured the triumph of his personal brand of authoritarian conservatism and the unity of his supporters. The man who claimed to support the restoration of the monarchy had made himself a dictator. True supporters of the king, like Eugenio Vegas Latapie, were outraged.
It seemed as if the new state created by Franco wasn't so much a state as a dictatorship run exclusively by him. Don Pedro Sainz Rodriguez says with some accuracy that the difference between laws and decrees in Franco's regime was that Franco pulled decrees out of one pocket and laws from the other. Everything was the exclusive wish of the Generalissimo.
Franco's regime was a conservative dictatorship, but it was cloaked in symbols and ritual of fascism. In the European economic depression of the 30s, fascism could be seen, and was seen, by many as an up-to-date alternative to the politics of class struggle. To unite a nation, even forcibly, in one supposed common interest, was a superficially attractive doctrine. At least it provided Franco, the reactionary soldier, with a facade of modern political ideology. Franco saw his task as blending the conflicting elements of the new Spain while maintaining the traditional values of the old. The charismatic fascist leader José Antonio Primo de Rivera was gone. Shot in a Republican jail, Franco assumed his mantle.
One could say Franco misrepresented José Antonio. He emphasized the inoffensive side, at least what was inoffensive to conservative people, and he silenced and buried anything that threatened them.
José Antonio had argued for the revolutionary upheaval of Spain's old order, but now he was dead. His name was carved in the stonework of Burgos Cathedral. Every church in Spain carried this potent legend. Thus the Franco Revolution became absorbed within the symbolism of Spain's deepest reaction, the church. And Franco presided.
España! España! José Antonio Primo Rivera! Arriba España!
José Antonio's memory was preserved, but the radical aspirations of his brand of fascism were laid to rest.
What José Antonio had predicted before the war came true. He had said that the Falange could contribute, without knowing it, to the restoration of a conservative bourgeois mediocrity of which, he commented, there is such a generous sample in Spain, and it would be adorned to add to the mockery with the choreographic figures of the blue shirts.
Se puso una careta de situación francamente fascista, como se decía entonces.
The regime presented a mask which was basically fascist, but deep down this wasn't the case. I would describe it as an economically conservative, authoritarian government because order had to be imposed, but with a facade and certain details from totalitarian regimes to be found elsewhere in Europe.
Franco drew on support from all aspects of the old Spain, but especially and naturally he found an enthusiastic champion in the church. The Republic had attacked it, both ideologically and physically. There was never any doubt as to where the church would stand now. It protested at Republican atrocities, but on the whole turned a blind eye to the same on the nationalist side.
El Cirineo le ayuda a llevar la cruz. Mirad este hombre que llora en silencio. Y le increpan diciendo, pues tan fácil corazón tiene el hombre, atémosle al cuello este Cristo y váyase a llorar en el fondo del río con él. Señor, la muerte se derramará sobre todas las cosas. Me acercaré al altar de Dios, al Dios que es alegría de mi juventud. Han arrancado a golpes la puerta del sagrario, que estaba abierta, y la mano que conoce más sangre registra la custodia. ¿Por qué os apresuráis, almas, en el despojo?
2 months after the start of the war, the Bishop of Salamanca declared that the military rebellion was a crusade. It didn't seem to matter that it was being fought by Moorish Muslim troops, whose religious symbol was not the cross, but the sword. The Church's endorsement, however, was reinforced by a letter from Spanish bishops to Catholics all over the world. In their words, the war was between the spiritual crusade in defense of law and order and the materialism of Russian Soviets. This letter was published 2 weeks after the rebels conquered the Basque country. Priests there, like other conservatives, served with the Basque Republican Army. For them, the defense of the Catholic faith was far from the same thing as Franco's crusade. They had seen the wartime republic as a cause of freedom for Basque regionalism. They had appealed to the Pope. But although the Vatican wavered, the Pope eventually recognized the Franco regime in the summer of 1937. He later sent a nuncio to represent him in Burgos. Undoubtedly, many Spaniards believed that Franco's campaign was a holy task, and Rome's approval was a great reinforcement to the devout.
Una emoción grande para mí fue mi encuentro con mi hermano, el que caería en la guerra, el pequeño.
A very moving experience for me was my meeting with my younger brother, who was later killed on the Northern Front. He'd asked for leave to come and see me.
Bajó con un permiso para saludarme y me preguntó, mira, Cristina, quería yo verte.
He said to me, look, Cristina, I wanted to see you because I wanted to ask you something. Those of us who die in the war, if we fight to defend God and Spain, as I'm doing, are we going to go to heaven as martyrs, even if the Church doesn't give us an official place in the register? I said I was sure they would, if they fought with that spirit, in the name of God and the motherland. Then God would give them a place among the martyrs in heaven.
The Spanish Church's endorsement, even sanctification of Franco's rebellion, was well rewarded. Religious education in state schools was again authorized. Church property was exempt from taxes. Civil marriage and divorce outlawed. Now Spain could properly be called national Catholic. Propaganda films carried the message to the faithful. This was how the rebel regime wanted or needed to be seen.
Mientras los soldados del Generalísimo abren las tierras de España al Mare Nostrum, este otro soldado, humilde y laborioso, labra los campos y da a su patria el pan nuestro de cada día. Fecundado con la sangre de tantos héroes, el suelo de España se cuaja de doradas espigas, de rubias mieses, símbolos de una patria con pan y justicia como el caudillo quiere.
Apart from the Foreign Legion and the Moors, the backbone of Franco's army were the Catholic peasants of Spain's agricultural heartland. In spite of their poverty-stricken standard of living, they chose to defend traditional values, the village and the church. They were frightened too by stories of forced collectivization in the Republican zone. With Franco, on the other hand, the price of their main crop, wheat, was guaranteed against ruinous fluctuation. Their income, however meager, was secure. In Castro Jerez, in Old Castile, the peasants had no doubt about supporting the right wing during the war, as they had done before it.
During the Republic, we supported the right. We had to support them because they were under attack.
During the Republic, we were persecuted, but after we were free. We could go home any time. Before, we couldn't even go out.
Florentino and Agapito were typical of a simple peasantry, reassured by the nationalist regime's maintenance of traditional values embodied in the church. Their faith was their dignity.
I believe that with the church there was respect. We respected each other more. Without religion there could be no respect, that's what I think. Without the church, the priest, they just bury you like a dog. Other people are against religion, but I've always been for it.
We joined Falange, and my brother was going to go to the front. But because he was my older brother, and he did more work than I did, my father said I should go in his place. In the end, he went off too.
The nationalist propaganda films idealized the traditional image of Spain, as distinct from the modern anomalies of the Republic.
También trabajan las mujeres curtidas al sol. No importan los callos ni las heridas. Son flores sangrantes del triunfo. España entera es milicia, y la milicia es austeridad, trabajo, resistencia y silencio.
The contrast between the position of women in the nationalist part of Spain and that in the Republican zone was extraordinary. The Republicans had emancipated women. Divorce was legalized. Discriminatory laws abolished. Now with the Civil War, some women even went to the front to fight. But in the nationalist zone, the senoras and senoritas of old Spain were revered in a subsidiary role. Pilar Primo de Rivera was the sister of José Antonio. She had been trapped in Republican Madrid at the start of the war.
No tenía un sentido, pues, por ejemplo, familiar.
They had no sense of family duty, and the divorce law had already divided us even more, because, of course, our Catholic way of life meant we could not accept it. In the nationalist zone, everything was much more constructive, more efficient, orderly and effective. There was a reason for everything. On the other side, there was chaos and a jumble of weird ideas. That is the truth.
When Pilar escaped to the nationalist zone, she set up a special women's section of the Falange, the fascist party.
Our
women didn't go to the trenches. They were auxiliaries at the front, in the infirmaries, in the washroom, in the hospitals. But our view was always that the woman's most important mission and her real place was in the family, at home.
Así que nosotros sí que defendíamos la integridad de la familia.
So we defended the integrity of the family, the devotion of the woman to the family, particularly when the children are small and can't look after themselves. Later, the woman could apply herself to her vocational work, her studies or whatever, but without taking that too far. We have always wanted to maintain a balance and give due priority to the defense of the family.
Camaradas, hoy vais a escuchar la voz de vuestro jefe. La misma voz que ha ordenado más de 100 batallas victoriosas viene ahora a hablaros a vosotras. La que escuchan atónitas las naciones viene a deciros hoy cuál es vuestra misión de mujeres dentro del movimiento. Por lo tanto, abrid vuestros sentidos para que no perdáis ni una sola de sus palabras ni uno solo de sus gestos. Arriba España.
Of course, it will be a man who is entrusted to direct the mission of women within the national movement.
En la ciudad de Santander se celebran cursos de cultura física organizados por la sección femenina de Falange Española Tradicionalista y de las Jons. Junto al mar Cantábrico y en donde Castilla se asoma al mar, la escuela de danza practica diario sus ejercicios. La Nueva España cultiva su cuerpo y su espíritu y se prepara para crear una patria mejor.
The nationalist propaganda emphasized the wholesome, domestic aspects of the regime. Franco's daughter promoted this in a newsreel made for German children, with a little help from her father.
¿Quieres decirle algo a los niños alemanes?
¿Pero qué les digo?
Lo que quieras.
Pido a Dios que todos los niños del mundo no conozcan los sufrimientos y las tristezas que tienen los niños que están aún en poder de los enemigos de mi patria. Yo deseo que todos los niños españoles tengan una casa alegre, con cariño y con juguetes. Y por eso envío un beso a todos los niños del mundo.
As the rebels' army secured more territory, the propaganda cameras showed the charitable work of the nationalists in the captured Republican towns. A women's organization, Auxilio Social, modeled on its Nazi counterpart, Winter Help, doled out bread. From the start of the war, the rebels held most of the food-producing regions of Spain. This gave them a powerful weapon both in preserving morale in their own zone and taunting the increasingly hungry Republicans. The enforced unity and morale of the Nationalists seemed in stark contrast to the dejected squabbling that had beset the Republic even before the war.
Toda la radio era triunfalista.
Everything on the radio boasted of victory. We were always winning, we were triumphant, we were strong. That's what we all felt at that time. So we were the victors, we were winning, we were the ones with God on our side. All the soldiers carried a small piece of material with the image of Jesus' heart. It was thought that God was helping us because that was how it should be. It had to be.
Im Lichte der aufgehenden Sonne nationaler Traditionen zeichnen sich immer klarer die Umrisse eines neuen Spanien, einig, groß und frei.
Nazi Germany and Italy had formally recognized the rebel regime during the siege of Madrid. From the first days, they had been supplying more and more military aid. When the German ambassador, General von Faupel, took the salute at the recognition ceremony, Franco described his allies as the bulwarks of culture, civilization, and Christianity in Europe. This moment, he said, marks the peak of life in this world. Franco did not, however, follow his Axis allies too far down the path of fascism, nor did he, much to their annoyance, follow them into the Second World War. But he willingly, if not gratefully, accepted their practical aid, simply because without it, he could not have carried on the war. When it was finally over, Spain had to repay Germany £116 million. Nearly £2 billion in today's money. But the Germans were not altruistic. They needed a steady flow of minerals for their own Nazi war machine. They suggested taking over Spanish mines. For a long time, Franco resisted. But later, when he desperately needed supplies for a final offensive, he agreed to a German majority shareholding of 5 mining companies. The fact of this odd triangular relationship was that Franco's Spain was much closer in temperament to Italy. The Italians encouraged Franco to be more fascist, thereby to remove the well-founded suspicion that his was merely a conservative reactionary regime. They were only marginally successful. Spain adopted fascist-style institutions, but only one piece of legislation of Franco's new state reflected the revolutionary fascist influence of Italy. A labor charter setting up corporate trade unions. When Franco set up his first cabinet in the winter of 1937, it faithfully reflected the traditional forces of conservative Spain. It had 4 men from the new unified political movement, but only one of them had any connection with the pre-war revolutionary Phalange. There were 2 personal friends of Franco. There were 4 military men and 2 monarchists, including Pedro Sáenz Rodríguez.
He was supported by the army, but he took great care that the military men who entered the government would not take it over. What he presented was not exactly a military dictatorship, but a government of the Falange and of the Traditionalists. Nevertheless, the Falange was just a sort of loincloth of his personal dictatorship.
The genuine Phalangists and Traditionalists were prepared to do anything for the sake of their cause, so Franco could trust neither.
para el mismo Franco. Así fueron sustituidos los auténticos.
Thus, the true party people were replaced with pseudo-phalangists and pseudo-traditionalists.
Finalmente, pero de forma progresivamente decreciente.
And even they were gradually pushed aside, as Franco increasingly relied on the right-wing groups which, although they were not proper parties, supported him until the end of his life.
Innominadamente. Hasta el final de su vida fue así.
We had absolute confidence in him. The Falange wanted to run things and he sent them packing. He wanted his brother-in-law to sort out the Falange, and he got rid of him too. He couldn't have cared less. His attitude was, I'm following the path I've set for myself. And that was that. And that's what he did.
As his Minister of Public Order, Franco appointed General Martínez de Nido. This man's reputation was based on his brutal repression of anarchists in Barcelona in the 1920s. Nido's appointment marked Franco's determination above all to strictly suppress any working-class resistance. If anyone was caught with any association with working-class parties or trade unions, they were summarily dealt with. Francisco Payatas Lopez, a lawyer, had escaped assassination squads in Republic in Madrid, but he found justice was no fairer in the nationalist zone.
Entraban, por ejemplo, 20 individuos.
20 people would go in and the trial would take less than a quarter of an hour. There wasn't even time for them to make statements, nothing at all. It was even worse than the executions without trial because, on top of everything, it was making a mockery of justice, giving an appearance of legality to something which was not legal at all. And also, as I learnt later on, Franco insisted that only 1 in 5 people could be acquitted. That was the highest proportion.
The nationalist passion for the unity of Spain meant stamping on all aspirations for autonomy of the traditionally distinctive regions of Catalonia and the Basque Country. In the Basque Country, the physical devastation was matched with the attempt to destroy the spirit of Basque nationalism. The Basque language was prohibited. Even the road signs were painted out. In April 1938, as Franco's army was poised to invade Catalonia, he announced the abolition of the region's home rule. The decree proclaimed that Catalonia would now have the honor of being governed on an equal footing with the rest of Spain. Before the war was over, it became clear what that honor entailed. The so-called law of political responsibilities retrospectively made anyone who had been an active Republican for 18 months before the war liable to prosecution. It included anyone who resisted Franco during the war. More often than not, the sentence was death, even if it wasn't always carried out. By the spring of 1938, he was already rounding up thousands of Republican soldiers and sending them to concentration camps. And the war still had a year to run.